In this video, we're going to discuss China's involvement in World War I. And in particular, this video should be viewed in concert with the earlier video on Yuan Shikai and the betrayal of the 1911 revolution. Why? Well, China's involvement in World War I was inseparable from the post-revolutionary goal of trying to reestablish sovereignty, Chinese sovereignty. In a nutshell, China participated in World War I, how we will discuss, in order to try to get a seat at an eventual peace treaty table so that it could renegotiate unequal treaties, reacquire territories that had been taken by other colonial powers, and in essence to just increase its standing on the international stage. And we're going to see how it tried to do that and also what the outcomes were. So First World War obviously is from 1914 to 1918, and it is part of these post-imperial hopes that I discussed in the previous video, in particular sovereignty and anti-imperialism. Now, from the perspective of China, and largely East Asia in general, World War I was something of a lull in an otherwise, especially from China's perspective, unbroken chain of increasingly aggressive and violent European colonialism and imperial aggression. In essence, European powers were so bogged down in their own massacre that the pressure, imperial pressure on the non-Western world subsided to a certain degree, especially in East Asia. Now, this is not the same, of course, in the Ottoman Empire, or what we now think of as the Middle East, but that's because, of course, the Ottoman Empire is a belligerent in this war. But in the case of East Asia, and China in particular, there is a moment of the ability to breathe, at least with respects to European and American aggression. The story of Japanese imperialism is very different, because at the same time, World War I was, from the perspective of East Asian countries, an opportunity as well. One opportunity was the one afforded to Japan. So Japan, as we've already seen, has very aggressively, since the 1870s, very aggressively begun to expand its sphere of influence. It has fought one war with China, Qing China, another war with Russia, all for dominance over Korea, Northeast Asia, and so forth. Well, that trajectory has not stopped. It changes, it ebbs and flows, but that trajectory hasn't stopped. And so, from Japan's perspective, the momentary distraction of European powers opens up an avenue or a window of opportunity for Japan to more forcibly assert itself in East Asia. To put it lightly, or to put it simply, remember back to the First Sino-Japanese War, 1894-95. Japan wins that war, and in the original terms of the treaty that was signed between Qing China and Meiji Japan, Meiji Japan didn't just acquire Taiwan, it also acquired this large mainland portion of the empire. But European powers, this triple intervention of European powers, were very fearful of Japan's growing influence and forced Japan to give it back. Well, since European powers were busy slaughtering one another, there was very little chance that if Japan were to assert itself again, that any European power would have the capacity to force Japan to give anything back. So this was something of an opportunity from Japan's perspective. It was also an opportunity for Japan to assert itself vis-a-vis a certain subset of European powers. In short, Japan enters the war relatively quickly on the side of England. And there is, for example, Anglo-Japanese coordinated attacks on German holdings, especially in the city of Qingdao and in the Shandong region. So these are the territories that back in 1898 the Germans had forcibly taken triggering the scramble for concessions. Well, now Japanese forces would attack German holdings. They would declare war against Germany and in their alliance treaty with England. They would join that side of the war, and they laid siege to German holdings in Qingdao. And you can see this very sort of potent photograph from history, a number of these. But Japanese forces eventually took hold of German prisoners of war and German holdings, and now Japanese military forces were now the occupiers or holders of once German holdings in China. So this is, again, this opportunity from the perspective of Japan to assert itself. Well, it's also an opportunity for China. China has to decide for itself whether or not it's going to become involved in the war, whether or not it's going to be neutral, whether or not it's going to declare war and become a belligerent, or somewhere in between. Remember, 1914, Yuan Shikai is still alive. He is still in the midst of all of this turmoil that he has triggered with the assassination of Song Jiaren and the outlawing of the Nationalist Party and the dissolution of Parliament. He is still the head honcho here during this decision of whether or not we should take part. On the one hand, there was fear that if China did not take part, then this left China open to the possibility of further European or foreign aggression. For example, at a eventual peace treaty, what would it mean if China were not at, in this case, the Treaty Paris and the treaty discussion, or the discussions at the Treaty of over the Treaty of Versailles? What would it mean if China weren't at the table, so to speak? Well, as the saying goes, if you're not at the table, you're on the menu. And so there was this sense that China has to take part. We see Japan taking part. And so how are we going to do this? But there was an equal risk that if China were to declare war outright and become a belligerent in this, that this might further justify or open up attacks by whichever European powers China had declared war on. So if we declare war against Germany, does this mean that Germany will now have carte blanche to expand its territories? And so you can see the kind of balancing act that they were in. So a plan was hatched, and this is towards 1915 and into 1916. So we're getting to the part where Yuan Shikai will die of natural causes and leave this chaos, this political vacuum in his wake. But in 1916, a project emerges in which China will commit laborers, non-belligerent laborers, to the war effort of France and England in particular. This is a brainchild of a man named Liang Shi, and he calls it laborers in the place of soldiers, 以工代兵. So the basic premise of this is the bloodshed on in the European theater is so ungodly. The loss of life is so unprecedented that there are simply not enough spare French male bodies and English male bodies to do things like dig trenches or transport goods or do all of the logistics that are essential to winning a war. Remember, the term logistics emerges as a wartime concept. Logistics from lodging, where do we lodge our troops? And logistics like Amazon is really the descendant of wartime logistics. Transportation, of feeding, of digging of trenches, of digging of, embankments and so forth and so on. So the idea here is China will give you those laborers. We will dedicate male, able-bodied men as non-belligerents. They will not be armed in this conflict. So we're not declaring war on anybody, but they will be peacetime, assistance in these kinds of hard labor things that you need. And what will end up happening is that somewhere in the order of 140,000 Chinese men will travel largely to France in order to take part in this. And the kind of transportation network of this is fascinating. They'll travel largely, over towards the east, towards Canada, take the Canadian railway all the way to the coast, and then complete their journey. So this massive dedication and commitment of labor power. Now, what are their goals? Well, the goals are manifold. One is that Germany is, for example, a holder of a large piece of the Boxer indemnity. So China owes Germany a whole lot of money by this point still. And so if China were to participate on the side of Britain and France in this conflict, that at an eventual peace treaty, it could be largely assumed that the German share would be abrogated, would just be nulled out. Furthermore, Germany, of course, holds colonial possessions in China. The goal here would be to recover those. But then on top of this, by being a kind of, erstwhile member of the international community by taking part in this war, this would prove China's participation in the family of modern nations and therefore place it in a better standing to renegotiate the now dozens upon dozens of unequal treaties that still shape Chinese finance and economics and politics and so forth. So we need to be at the peace treaty. We need to be there to get these specific things that we want, but also to place us in a better position to renegotiate all of these other things that we want. Incidentally, the laborers I'm referring to here, coolies, this derives from the origins or the etymology of this word coolie is contested. Some say that it emerges out of this Chinese term kuli, bitter labor. Others say that that's complete nonsense and that it derives from sort of the region of what we now think of as Southeast Asia, Dutch East Indies, these regions from non-Chinese languages. But in any event, the laborers that China will send to France are often referred to in the French language, the English language, as coolies. Now, let's be realistic here. The idea of them as these laborers as non-belligerents is really in theory only. Many of these men will die in conflict. They are in the war zone. They are in the battle, on the battlefields. So the idea that they are away from, the machinery of death of this war is really a mythology. And it's a mythology that China has to uphold because it does not want Germany to use this as an excuse or the Austro-Hungarian Empire to use this as an excuse to try to make inroads into China, which would be justified if China were outright to declare war the way that Japan did. Now, the effort will culminate in the eventual peace treaty that brings the war to an end, the Treaty of Versailles. Now, I just do want to remind you at this point that Yuan Shikai has just died. And one of the complicating factors here is that there is no single stable regime anymore that can realistically claim to govern China. There are many that make that claim because they hold Beijing, perhaps. But by this point, China has broken up into a series of regions known as, typically referred to as Warlord Regions. Pardon the graphics here are not of the highest quality. I'll find you a better map at some point. But China has broken up into a series of very large regional power bases, each of which are under the control of a different largely military commanders, and that's where the term warlord, the Warlord Era, comes from. Some of the major warlords we have: Feng Yuxiang, Zhang Zuolin, Wu Peifu, Sun Chuanfang. These are military officers. Many of them were actually somewhere within the officer hierarchy serving under Yuan Shikai, but now without any legitimate either civilian or military government that can claim total control over this place called China. China is for 10 years completely shattered into this ever-changing constellation of competing warlord regions. These are the conditions under which China has to try China, whatever this word China means at this point, is participating in World War I. Well, Japan continues its opportunistic attacks at this point and uses the First World War as a way of increasing its inroads into China. And this is exemplified in what is known as the 21 Demands, which were basically this just one-sided unilateral set of demands issued in 1915 by the Japanese government to Yuan Shikai, and then eventually was continued negotiations under whoever held Beijing at the time. But just take a look at some of the pieces of these 21 demands just to get a sense of how far-reaching they are. The Chinese government agrees that the consent of the Japanese government shall be obtained in advance, 1, whenever it is proposed to grant to other nationals, other foreigners, the right of constructing a railway, or to obtain from other nationals, again foreigners, the supply of funds for constructing a railway in South Manchuria, Eastern Mongolia. What this means, in effect, if you parse the legalistic language of this, is Northeast China economically, infrastructurally belongs to us. No other foreign power can build railway or can fund the building of a railway without our permission. And oh, by the way, we ain't given permission. Number two, whenever a loan is to be made from with any other foreign power under the security of South Manchuria, Eastern and Inner Mongolia, Japanese permission has to be sought in advance. So in essence, this was not annexation. It wasn't anywhere near that, but this was, by economic and legalistic means, basically the economic conquest of Northeast China. This is saying that economically, you have no sovereignty over this territory, and now all of these things that a country should be allowed to do just if they want to, get funds, let people come in and build whatever they want, is no longer permitted. Now Japan has the final right of refusal. As one person from this era had said, and quoted in this wonderful book by historian Xu Guoqi, the 21 demands were worse than many presented by a victor to his vanquished enemy. Whoa, now think about this. Worse than any presented by a victor to his vanquished enemy. Japan and China did not fight a war. China did not lose some war that I haven't mentioned yet in the year 1915. This was just the Japanese state saying, oh, by the way, this is what we demand. Now, there was a little bit of pushback. Some of these elements of these demands were either not agreed to or kind of foot dragged on. But by and large, this thing was foisted upon the Chinese government at the time. So this is part and parcel to an expansion, a radical expansion of Japanese colonial presence in East Asia. And this will culminate in the pivotal moment of the 19-teens and certainly of China's involvement in the First World War. Well, World War I ended. The Treaty of Versailles, this multi-month, very complex set of negotiations that people are still parsing the words over. Basically, you know, all of the major figures from certainly the Western world, the United States, North America, the non-Western world were present. And all of them were trying to figure out the future of the world, of the shape of the world. Well, China was among them. And as I mentioned, one of the things that China wanted above all else was the restoration of German-controlled territories in China back to Chinese control. Well, I think you kind of guessed where I'm going here. China did not get that. Instead, those territories, which were at this point under Japanese control, thanks to the Japanese occupation of those regions and the taking of Germans as prisoners of war, those territories were not given back to China. They were given formally to Japan. When news of this came, there was a massive, spontaneous, demonstration, political demonstration in cities across China, but especially in Beijing. And the largest of these took place on May 4th, 1919. And this is the event that gives its name to the so-called May 4th movement. And that is the reason why this period of political and cultural and artistic experimentation and kind of promiscuity that takes place in the 19-teens is sometimes referred to as the New Culture movement, but is also often referred to as the May 4th movement, kind of taking from this one moment. And I'll close this particular video just with an excerpt of the Manifesto of all Beijing students issued on May 4th, 1919, to get a sense of the sense of crisis that so many held in kind of in their hearts, not only with the outcome of the First World War and this betrayal of China by giving this territory to Japan and not to China, but also the ineptitude of Chinese leaders for allowing that to happen. I mean, how shitty were the negotiators to allow that to happen? But also the betrayal of the 1911 revolution, the collapse of Chinese central control into the Warlord region. I mean, you get a sense in this manifesto in 1919 how desperate and how worried people were. This is the last chance for China in her life and death struggle Today we swear 2 solemn oaths with all our countrymen. China's territory may be conquered, but it cannot be given away. The Chinese people may be massacred, but they will not surrender. Our country is about to be annihilated. Up, brethren. I'll close with that, and when we return in a later video, we're going to dive into the New Culture movement, or the May 4th movement, more squarely, to see what this period of crisis gave rise to in the realm of the arts. I'll see you in the next video.